The wind swept low across Copper Bend, carrying the sting of ice and the faint smell of pine from the dark line of hills beyond the town. Snow clung to the warped edges of rooftops, gathering in the seams where old boards leaned against one another, and the light of dawn came thin and pale, glancing off frozen window panes. Horses shifted in their stalls behind the livery, the muted thud of hooves on packed earth mixing with the creak of signboards swaying in the brittle air. The street lay almost empty, save for a few bundled figures hurrying toward the warmth of their stoves, breath trailing behind them like ghosts reluctant to leave. Elias McKenna stepped down from his wagon in front of the mercantile, the boards groaning under his weight. He carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who had spent most of his life listening more than speaking, and whose silences often said more than any man's words could. His coat was heavy and plain, the hem brushed with frost, his hat pulled low against the wind. He moved to the back of the wagon, gloved hands closing around the rough burlap of a grain sack. He hefted it with ease, his boots biting into the snow-scabbed planks. The sound of his work, the thud of each sack set down on the mercantile stoop, rang in the stillness. Elias did not look toward the clusters of townsfolk at the pump across the street, though he could feel their eyes drift to him, linger, and move on again. In Copper Bend, he was the man who had buried his wife before the ground had thawed one March, and who had not been seen in the company of any woman since. A burst of brittle laughter from the pump carried to his ears. He glanced up, just enough to see three women bent together against the cold, shawls drawn tight, their hands working the pump handle in turns. Their voices lowered when they noticed his gaze. One shook her head slightly as if at some bitter thing she'd just heard, and the other's eyes darted toward the livery. Elias's gaze followed. From the shadows between the livery's open doors, a figure stepped unsteadily into the daylight. She was small, the skirt of her dress clinging to her knees where snow had melted and refrozen. The cloth at her back was torn, and beneath it her skin showed in narrow welts, angry, raised, and raw against the winter air. Her breath came in shallow puffs, her eyes scanning the street as if measuring the distance to every doorway, every escape. The street seemed to hold its breath. Behind her, the tall frame of Sheriff Wade Halloran filled the doorway. His coat hung open, the silver star on his chest catching what little light the morning offered. There was an ease in his stance, a predator's patience in his eyes. He spoke her name, quietly enough that Elias couldn't hear it, but the sound made her flinch as though struck. "Please," she gasped, voice cracking like thin ice over a stream. "I can't take another whip." It was not loud, yet every soul within earshot seemed to hear it. Her hands trembled as she drew them close to her body, as if she could somehow fold herself smaller, invisible. Elias set down the sack he'd been carrying. The sound of it hitting the stoop was soft, but it broke the moment's stillness. He crossed the street without hurry, without words, his boots crunching over the frost-hardened snow. When he reached her, he unbuttoned his coat, lifting it from his shoulders and wrapping it around her without meeting her eyes. The weight of it hid the torn cloth at her back, covered the raw skin from the cold. Then he looked up at Halloran. The sheriff's smile did not reach his eyes. "That's my business, McKenna." Elias did not answer. His gaze held steady, the kind of look that could push a man back without so much as a step forward. Halloran's mouth twitched. The tension stretched between them, thin as a wire drawn taut. Around them, the street began to breathe again. The women at the pump turned away, drawing their shawls tighter. A man loading crates onto a wagon busied himself with knots that didn't need tightening. The world pretended not to watch. "Best be careful," Halloran said at last, his voice like boots grinding over gravel. "You wouldn't want folks thinking you were getting in the way of the law." Elias's expression didn't change. He reached for the edge of his coat where it wrapped the young woman and pulled it closer around her shoulders. Without another word, he guided her past him, toward his wagon. She followed, her steps faltering in the snow, but she didn't resist. He lifted her onto the wagon seat with a gentleness at odds with his size, then took the reins and turned the team toward the road leading out of town. He did not look back, but he could feel Halloran's stare trailing after them until the mercantile and the livery were no more than shapes fading into the white. The road wound between bare cottonwoods, their branches etched black against the sky. The wind followed them, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the chimneys behind. The woman pulled the coat tighter around her, her face hidden. Elias did not ask her name, nor where she'd come from. His hands stayed steady on the reins, eyes fixed on the way ahead. They passed the frozen bend of the creek, the ice mottled where the current still fought beneath. The team's breath steamed in the air, and the creak of the wagon wheels seemed louder with each mile they left behind. Elias noticed how she shivered, though whether from cold or something deeper, he couldn't tell. By the time the shape of his barn rose out of the white haze ahead, the light had shifted, sun spilling weakly through a gap in the clouds, glinting off the snow piled high against the fence rails. Elias guided the wagon into the yard, pulling up near the barn doors. He climbed down, the snow crunching under his boots, and came around to her side. She didn't move until he offered his hand. Her fingers were cold, the skin chapped, but her grip was sure enough to let him help her down. Without speaking, he led her into the barn. The smell of hay and horseflesh wrapped around them, warmer than the air outside. He gestured to a low bench near the tack wall. She sank onto it, still clutching his coat. From a shelf, he took a folded blanket and set it beside her, then crossed to the far stall to check the water bucket. She sat motionless, her eyes tracing the lines of the boards, the glint of tools hanging from their pegs. He didn't press her. Instead, he set a tin cup of warm water on the bench, close enough that she could reach it without rising. Then he stepped back, the barn door opened just enough to let in the pale light. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of hoofbeats, fading now, but they're all the same. Elias stood listening, his gaze fixed on the narrow slice of sky visible between the door and the frame. Behind him, the soft clink of the cup meeting would told him she'd taken a drink. He allowed himself one slow breath before stepping back into the daylight, letting the door close between them. Somewhere beyond the barn in the yard, the sheriff's shadow stretched longer than the winter day, and Elias knew it would find its way to his doorstep before long. The morning after Elias brought her to his land, the yard lay in a hush so deep the crows dared not break it. Frost silvered every fence post, and the pale sun struggled to climb above the ridge, spilling thin light across the snow. Smoke lifted from the barn chimney in a slow ribbon, curling and fading into the brittle air. Elias stepped from the house with an armful of split logs, his breath clouding before him. The barn doors were closed, but faint movement inside told him she was awake. He pushed the door open, letting a wedge of sunlight slide across the packed dirt floor. She sat on the bench where he'd left her the night before, his coat still around her shoulders. The blanket lay folded neatly at her side, untouched, as though she feared she might owe for its use. Her gaze flicked toward him, then away, as though afraid she might seem ungrateful if she met his eyes too long. Without speaking, he set the logs by the small iron stove in the corner, knelt, and fed the fire until the flames licked high. Heat began to creep into the air. He placed a tin plate on the bench near her, thick bread, a slice of cold venison, a cup of coffee that steamed against the cold. She glanced at it, her hands tightening around the coat, but made no move to eat. He left her to it, walking the length of the barn to check the stalls. His team nosed at the hay rack, ears flicking as he passed. In the loft above, a few pigeons shifted, the sound soft as sighs. When he turned back, she was nibbling the bread, taking small, careful bites as though testing whether the food might be taken from her. In town, tongues had already begun their work. By midday, Mrs. Dawes at the Mercantile had whispered to a neighbor that Elias McKenna had brought the sheriff's problem home with him. By evening, the tale had traveled to the saloon, where men leaned on the bar and speculated how long before Holleran came calling. None dared say much within the sheriff's hearing, but their glances were quick in knowing. The girl, they said, had been paying off a debt at the livery and somehow fallen afoul of him. The details shifted depending on the teller, but the undertone remained the same. Trouble followed her. That second morning, she ventured outside while Elias was mending a gate. She moved slowly as though her limbs still remembered blows. Her hair, dark and thick, was tied back with a strip of cloth. In the cold sunlight, her skin looked drawn, the faint shadow of bruises fading but not gone. She stood near the fence, watching the snow glitter on the far pasture. When Elias glanced up, she startled, retreating a step toward the barn. "You can walk the yard if you want," he said evenly. His voice carried no demand, only the simple fact of it. She nodded, her eyes downcast, and after a moment turned back toward the fence, her gloved fingers brushing along the rail as though testing its solidity. In the days that followed, a rhythm settled between them. Elias spoke little, but his silences were steady, not sharp. He left a basin of warm water each morning, a bar of soap beside it. Sometimes she used it before dawn, sometimes it remained untouched. He never asked why. On the fourth day, he returned from hauling hay to find her mending one of his gloves at the workbench. The stitches were fine and straight, the leather pulled tight where a seam had split. She didn't look up when he entered, her hands working with quiet precision. He set down his tools and left her to it, but that night, a fresh shawl appeared folded on the bench where she slept, the weave thick enough to hold out the wind. A week passed before she spoke more than a word or two. She was carrying a bucket from the pump when the handle slipped, sloshing water over her skirt. She muttered something sharp under her breath, a fragment of herself surfacing. Elias, from where he stood by the woodpile, caught the tone but not the words. It was the first time he'd heard her voice carry any heat. That evening, as the wind rose and the sky bruised toward night, Elias sat by the stove in the house, oiling the stock of his rifle. A soft knock at the door drew him up. She stood there hesitant, holding a small bundle in both hands, a pair of socks she'd knitted from coarse wool. The stitches were uneven but strong. "There for the cold," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the floor. He took them without comment, set them on the table, and stepped aside to let her in. She stood by the door, uncertain. The fire's warmth touched her face, and he saw the faint lift of color in her cheeks. In town the story grew sharper. A woman at the dressmaker's shop told her customer she'd heard Halloran intended to settle with McKenna soon enough. A deputy was seen riding past Elias's property at dusk, his eyes sweeping the yard before he turned back toward the road. At the saloon, laughter turned mean when her name came up, though no one dared repeat the sheriff's exact words. When Elias next went to the mercantile, the storekeeper's wife refused to look him in the eye. "We're out of the coffee you like," she said, though he could see a full sack behind her. He paid for the flour and nails he'd come for, the weight of their judgment riding back with him in the wagon. That night he set the coffee sack on the kitchen table, purchased instead from the saloon-keeper at twice the price. He didn't tell her, but the next morning when the smell of fresh coffee filled the barn, she looked up at him for a moment longer than usual. Slowly she began to claim small corners of the barn as her own. A folded length of fabric draped over a beam. A jar of buttons and thread tucked onto a shelf. She swept the floor in the mornings without being asked, fed the hens when he was away. Once, he found her singing under her breath as she worked, the tune so faint it might have been imagined. But the shadow of the sheriff hung over it all. Elias saw it in the way she paused when hoofbeats sounded on the road, her body going still until the sound faded. He saw it in the way she sat with her back to the wall, never the door. On the 12th day, while Elias was repairing a section of fence near the road, a rider approached. Deputy Haskins, his badge catching the light, pulled up just beyond the gate. "Sheriff says the woman owes him," Haskins called. "Says you're keeping what's his." Elias leaned on the fence post, his hat brim shading his eyes. "She's no one's property." Haskins shifted in the saddle, his mouth pulling into something between a smirk and a warning. "You do well to remember who keeps the law in Copper Bend." Elias said nothing. After a moment, the deputy turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. That evening the air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of bread. She had baked 3 small loaves, the crusts golden, cooling on the workbench. He stood in the doorway, the snow melting from his boots, and watched her wrap one loaf in cloth and set it aside. "For you?" he asked. "For when he comes," she said simply, not looking up. Her voice held no tremor, but something in the way she tied the cloth made his chest tighten. He thought of telling her he wouldn't let Halloran set foot past the gate. But he knew words in their world carried less weight than acts. The next morning, a brittle sky stretched over the land, the clouds thin as worn linen. The wind cut sharp across the pasture, and the air carried the heavy stillness that often preceded snow. As Elias moved through the yard, he caught her standing by the fence, looking toward the road. Her shoulders were straighter, her chin lifted a fraction higher than when she'd first arrived. "Storm coming," he said. She nodded, though her eyes didn't leave the road. "I can feel it." And for a moment he couldn't tell whether she meant the weather or the sheriff. The snow came heavy in the night, draping the land in a muffled stillness. By dawn, drifts had swallowed the fence rails in places, and the barn roof sagged under the weight. Elias worked through the morning with his collar turned up, shoveling paths between the house, barn, and woodpile. The air bit hard at his skin, the kind of cold that made every breath sting. From the corner of his eye, he saw her at the barn door, wrapped in the shawl he'd given her, her dark hair pulled low over her ears. She watched him work without stepping into the snow, her hands hidden in the folds of the fabric. By midday the sound of hooves on the packed road broke the quiet. A lone rider approached, moving slow as though in no hurry to meet the day. Wade Halloran reined up at the fence, leaning forward on his saddle horn. His hat was dusted white, the brim casting a shadow over his narrow eyes. "McKenna," the sheriff drawled, his voice carrying just enough to cross the yard. Elias planted his shovel, resting a hand on the handle. "She's got debts," Halloran said, jerking his chin toward the barn where she stood half hidden. "You know it?" I know it. Ain't good for a man to take on what ain't his. Elias's breath hung in the air between them. She's not yours to collect. The sheriff smiled faintly as if indulging a child's mistake. Law says different. Elias didn't answer. His stillness was its own reply. Halloran's gaze lingered a moment longer, then he turned his horse, snow crunching under the hooves, and rode back the way he came. That night, wind howled against the shutters, rattling them in their frames. Elias sat at the table, mending a strap, while in the corner the stove glowed red. She was seated on the bench near the door, darning a pair of socks. Her stitches were slow but sure, her head bent in concentration. The smell of wood smoke filled the air, mingled with the faint scent of bread she had baked that afternoon. Neither spoke of Halloran's visit, but both felt its weight in the room. Days lengthened under the grip of winter. The cold worked its way into bone and breath alike, and the rhythm of survival became a quiet pact between them. She began helping him with the stock, brushing down the horses, her movements hesitant at first, then more certain. In the evenings she mended gear, her work as steady as the ticking of the small brass clock on the shelf. One morning they rode into town together. The wagon wheels groaned over frozen ruts, the harness leather creaking with each step of the team. The town seemed to shrink against the cold, its buildings huddled close, smoke rising in thin columns. People looked up as they passed. Some offered curt nods, others turned away quickly. At the mercantile, Elias stepped inside ahead of her. The warmth hit like a wave, carrying the scents of coffee, flour, and oilcloth. She lingered near the door, her eyes scanning the shelves as though measuring her welcome. Mrs. Dawes stood behind the counter, her mouth set in a tight line. "Morning, Mr. McKenna." "Need flour, salt, and lamp oil," he said. The woman fetched them without comment, her eyes sliding past the figure at the door. When Elias reached for a spool of thread, Mrs. Dawes's hand covered it briefly. "That's not for her," she murmured, low enough that only he could hear. Elias met her gaze without blinking. "It's for the mending," he said, and set the spool on the counter. They left with the supplies, her hands folded tightly in her lap all the way home. He didn't ask what she was thinking, and she didn't offer. But that night he found the spool of thread on the bench in the barn, tucked neatly beside her work basket. The weeks turned on in this way, each day folding into the next, until the edges between them began to soften. She began to speak more, short sentences at first, mostly about the work at hand. One evening, while they were oiling tack, she told him in a quiet, flat voice about the night her husband died. The words came without tears, but her hand stilled on the leather strap. Elias listened without interrupting, his own hands working slowly, the fire casting their shadows long across the floor. It was the first time she had offered him a piece of her past. He didn't press for more, but from then on, their silences felt less like walls and more like spaces they shared. But the West was not kind to such fragile truces. One Sunday the sky was clear, the air so cold it seemed to crack when you breathed. They went to church, driving the wagon into town along the frozen road. Inside, the pews were crowded, the heat from the stove thick with the smell of damp wool. She sat beside him, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the hymnal though she did not sing. He felt the weight of eyes on them. A whisper ran like a thread through the congregation, words too soft to catch but sharp enough to feel. After the service, when they stepped outside, a woman drew her child close, murmuring something as she passed. The girl's eyes were wide, curious, but she was pulled away before she could linger. On the ride home, her gaze stayed on the road ahead. "They think I'm a whore," she said suddenly, her voice low but steady. "They're wrong," he replied. Her lips pressed together. "Doesn't matter." Snow flurried across the fields, chasing the wagon all the way to the yard. That evening, as the wind picked up and rattled the barn roof, Elias found her standing by the porch rail, her shawl wrapped tight, watching the snow sweep across the pasture. He stepped out beside her, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She took one, their fingers brushing. Neither spoke for a long while. In the dim light, her face looked calmer than he had seen it, less drawn, though the lines of caution still lingered at the corners of her mouth. The snow landed softly on her shawl, melting into dark patches. The quiet between them was broken by the distant rhythm of hooves. She stiffened, her eyes turning toward the road. The sound grew louder, resolving into 2 riders moving through the dusk. Elias set his mug down and stepped to the edge of the porch. The riders slowed as they neared the gate. One was Halloran, the other a broad-shouldered deputy. Halloran tipped his hat in mock greeting. "Evenin', McKenna. Thought I'd see how our friend's getting on." "She's not your friend," Elias said evenly. Halloran's smile was cold. "No, she's my debtor. And debt's a law matter." The deputy shifted in his saddle, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. Elias's hand stayed loose at his side, but his stance had changed, weight balanced, eyes steady. "You'll get nothing here," Elias said. A long pause. The wind hissed through the bare branches. Halloran's gaze slid toward her where she stood behind Elias, her face half hidden in the shadow of the porch. Something in her eyes made his smile falter, though he covered it quickly. "Suit yourself," he said at last, reining his horse around. "I'll be back." The two men rode off into the gathering dark, their shapes swallowed by the snow. Elias stayed at the edge of the porch until the sound of hoofbeats was gone. When he turned, she was watching him, not with fear but with something sharper, more difficult to name. She set her mug down, her hands still curled loosely around the warmth. That night, neither of them spoke much. But when Elias rose before dawn to tend the stock, he found the barn swept clean, the feed laid out, and a fresh loaf of bread cooling on the bench. The weight of the West lay heavy on them both, its silences, its judgments, its readiness to crush the fragile shoots of trust before they could take root. But in the small acts, the coffee shared on the porch, the mended glove, the bread on a cold morning, they found something worth holding against it. The next day broke clear, the snow hard underfoot. Elias spent the morning chopping wood by the barn, the steady rhythm of the axe splitting the air. She came to the doorway holding out a scarf she had knitted, thick, with a simple pattern, the wool soft. "For the wind," she said. He took it without a word, looping it once around his neck before returning to the woodpile. When he glanced back, she was still there, watching him, the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. Late that afternoon, as the sun bled out over the horizon, Elias spotted movement on the far edge of the pasture. A lone rider sat motionless, too far to make out his face, but the set of his shoulders told enough. Halloran hadn't left. He was waiting. The wind carried a restless edge that morning, sharp enough to make the pines groan in their roots. A pale sun bled across the snowfields, casting long shadows that reached toward the house like black fingers. Elias had been splitting logs since first light, his axe finding the grain with a rhythm that steadied him more than it warmed him. He felt her eyes from the barn door, though she didn't step out. She had been quieter since the rider's shadow lingered at the pasture days before, her gaze often fixed on the horizon as if measuring the distance to danger. By midday, the sound of hammering in the cold air drew her from the barn. She found him reinforcing the latch on the gate, his gloved hands sure and deliberate. "Expecting trouble?" she asked, her voice low, testing. He didn't look up. "Always best to be ready." A flicker of something crossed her face, gratitude, maybe, or the memory of a time when readiness had come too late. She stepped closer, pulling the shawl tight around her shoulders, and said nothing more. When the trouble came, it did so with the arrogance of certainty. 2 days later, Elias returned from the far pasture to find a notice nailed to the post at the head of his drive. The paper flapped in the wind, its edges curling. He tore it free and read the bold, block letters. "Abigail Holt T.O. report to Sheriff's Office for restitution. Failure to comply will result in jailing." Beneath, Halloran's signature sprawled like a wound. She read it over his arm, her face paling but her jaw tightening. "It means he'll come here." "He already planned to," Elias said. He folded the paper once, then again, until the words disappeared into his palm. "He'll have to step onto my land to do it." That night, she was gone when he came in from the barn. Panic lit in his chest, cold and sharp, until he saw her shape moving along the road toward the town. He caught up to her before the bend, his breath ghosting in the dark. "You can't stop him if I'm not here," she said without turning. He caught her arm, not rough but unyielding. "Not alone. Not ever again." The words held no heat, only the solidity of something that would not move. She searched his face in the moonlight, and whatever she saw there was enough to halt her. Slowly she turned back toward the house. From then on, he carried his rifle in easy reach, the barrel oiled, the stock worn smooth from years of use. She began baking bread in the evenings, setting aside loaves and cloth as though preparing for a siege. Neither spoke aloud. The air between them held no fear now, only the knowledge of what was coming. It was late afternoon when the sound of horses on the road reached them, 3 of them, the cadence of hooves steady and deliberate. Elias stepped onto the porch, his rifle resting against his leg. She stood in the shadow of the barn doorway, the hem of her skirt brushing the packed snow. Halloran rode at the front, his coat unbuttoned despite the cold, the silver of his badge catching the pale light. 2 deputies flanked him, both younger, both with eyes that wouldn't quite meet Elias's. "Step aside, McKenna," Halloran called, reining in at the gate. Elias didn't move. "You're not welcome here." The sheriff's smile was a thin blade. "Don't make me take her by force. You know the law's on my side." "The law's whatever you think you can get away with," Elias replied. His voice was calm, but each word settled into the air with weight. Halloran swung down from his horse, the snow crunching under his boots. The deputies followed, exchanging a quick glance. "Last chance," he said, taking a step toward the porch. Elias shifted, his hand brushing the stock of the rifle. "Turn back." The wind had stilled, leaving only the creak of leather, the breath of horses, and the slow beat of boots on snow. Halloran's eyes slid past Elias to where she stood in the barn's shadow. His smile widened, cold and knowing. "You really think you can keep her from me forever?" he said, his voice soft now, dangerous. Elias didn't answer. But his silence was not empty, it was the same unmovable thing she had felt in his grip on the road, in the way he stood between her and every shadow that threatened to reach. Halloran took another step, closing the distance. Somewhere behind him, one of the deputies shifted uneasily, his hand tightening on the reins. The snow under Elias's boots creaked as he moved forward, closing the gap until they were only a few paces apart. The cold wrapped around them both, but neither man seemed to feel it. Her breath caught in the doorway, her hands curling into the shawl. The whole world seemed to narrow to that space between the two men. The windless air, the pale light, the unspoken promise that something would break if one more step was taken. Halloran's eyes flicked down to the rifle, then back up. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, but there was a flicker beneath it, something not quite as sure as he wanted it to be. "You've made yourself part of her debt," he said. "You'll regret it." Elias didn't blink. Not today. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The horses stamped in the snow, steam rising from their nostrils. Then Halloran stepped back, slow, as though conceding nothing. He jerked his head toward the deputies, and they mounted without a word. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying a promise that wasn't bluster. Then he swung into the saddle and turned toward the road, his men following. They rode off at a measured pace, but Elias didn't lower his rifle until the sound of hooves had faded into the distance. Only then did he turn toward the barn. She was still in the doorway, her eyes locked on his, something unreadable moving behind them. And far off, beyond the line of the ridge, a single column of smoke began to rise into the cold sky, too thin and too dark to be a hearth fire, and in a place no house stood, snow had fallen through the night without pause, blanketing the yard until the fence rails were little more than white humps in the pale morning light. The world outside was quiet enough that every creak of timber in the house seemed loud, every breath visible in the cold air. Elias stood at the window, the rifle leaning against the wall beside him. The horizon was washed in a dull gray, the kind of sky that made sound travel far and gave no shelter to secrets. She moved softly behind him, the rustle of her skirts carrying in the stillness. She had tied her hair back, though stray strands fell to frame her face. The shawl was wrapped close around her, but her chin was lifted, eyes following his to the road. Neither spoke. The silence between them was not hesitation but readiness, a shared understanding that the quiet would soon break. The first hint came as a faint vibration in the air, a deep, steady thrum that was not wind. Elias stepped to the porch, snow crunching under his boots. The sound grew into the rhythmic beat of hooves, deliberate and unhurried. Over the rise, 3 riders appeared, their dark forms sharp against the snow. Wade Halloran led them, his posture easy, as though the cold and the purpose of his ride were nothing to him. They came to the gate without hurry, drawing their horses to a stop. Halloran's breath misted as he smiled up at Elias. "Cold morning to be standing out here," he said, his voice smooth, almost genial. "You know why I've come." Elias said nothing, but the set of his shoulders left no doubt that he did. "You've had your time to think," Halloran went on. "She's coming with me. That's the law." "She's not yours," Elias said, his tone flat as the winter horizon. The sheriff swung down from his horse, boots breaking the snow crust with a sound like snapping bones. His gloved hands rested at his sides, close enough to his gun to remind everyone of its presence. "Law says otherwise," he murmured. From the shadow of the porch, she stepped forward until she stood beside Elias. Her presence was quiet but unflinching, the shawl stirring slightly in the wind. Halloran's eyes tracked her, the smile sharpening. "You think hiding behind him changes what you owe me?" She didn't answer. Her gaze was steady, the cold in her eyes matching the air. Elias moved a half step in front of her, the barrel of the rifle angled down but ready. Halloran's deputies dismounted, boots crunching in unison. They spread slightly, the shape of a familiar pattern, 3 points to box in their quarry. Elias shifted, reading the weight of each man's stance, the way their eyes darted between him and the woman at his back. "Step aside," Halloran said again, his voice low, the false warmth stripped away. Elias didn't move. "Go back to town." The sheriff's hand twitched near his gun belt, and in that moment the distance between them became a fuse waiting for a spark. Snowflakes drifted in the still air, falling between them like slow-moving ash. The horses stamped and tossed their heads, their breath clouding in the cold. When Halloran stepped forward, Elias's rifle came up, not fast, not showy, but with the inevitability of a door closing. The sheriff froze, his smile tightening at the edges. "You going to shoot me in front of her?" he asked, tilting his head toward the woman. "If you try to take her, you won't be walking away," Elias said, each word slow, measured. One of the deputies shifted uneasily. The other's hand closed over the grip of his pistol, but he didn't draw. Halloran's eyes narrowed, the smile gone now, replaced by a thin line of calculation. "You think this ends here?" "I'll have the law on you before nightfall," he said. "You are the law here," Elias replied. "That's the problem." For a long moment no one moved. The sound of the wind pressing against the drifts was the only thing in the world. Then Halloran's hand darted, not for his gun but for the whip coiled at his belt. In the same breath, Elias stepped forward, catching the lash as it unfurled, the leather biting into his palm. He yanked, pulling Halloran off balance, their boots churning snow into hard clumps beneath them. The sheriff stumbled, his shoulder striking the porch rail. Elias let the whip fall between them, the coiled leather sinking into the snow. "You won't touch her again," he said, his voice low, steady enough to cut through the cold. Halloran straightened, his face dark with something that was not just anger but the humiliation of being handled in front of his men. He took a step forward, but Elias met him head-on, his frame filling the space between the sheriff and the woman. One deputy took a step back. The other looked to Halloran, waiting for a cue that didn't come. The wind rose, rattling the bare branches overhead, and the moment stretched long enough for the truth to settle in the sheriff's eyes. This fight would not go the way he wanted. Abigail moved then, not to hide but to close the space between herself and Elias. She stepped around him, bent and lifted the whip from the snow. The leather hung limp in her hands. Without looking at Halloran, she dropped it at Elias's feet, her shoulders straight, her chin high. The sound it made against the snow was small, but it carried. Halloran's jaw clenched, his gloved hands curling once before he turned sharply away. "Mount up," he barked to his deputies. They obeyed without a word, swinging into their saddles. Halloran followed, pausing only long enough to throw a look back at Elias. A look that held no promise of surrender, only the certainty that this was not the last of it. Then they were gone, the steady rhythm of hooves fading into the gray. Elias stood in the yard long after the sound had disappeared, the rifle still in his hands. Snow began to fall again, soft and slow, settling over the churned ground where the confrontation had played out. He turned at last to find her watching him, the wind catching at the loose strands of her hair. He stepped forward, lifting the coat from his shoulders and placing it around hers. She didn't flinch this time. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw no fear, only the quiet strength of someone who had decided she would no longer run. They stood like that for a long moment, the snow settling over them, the yard, the empty road beyond. The cold pressed in from every side, but between them it felt less sharp, less able to bite. In the distance, the ridge lay half lost in the falling snow, the world beyond it veiled. But for now, the space between the porch and the fence felt enough, a place held not by walls or law, but by the will of two people standing against the storm. And somewhere in that stillness, where the air hummed with the memory of what had just passed, the truth settled between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together, side by side in the snow.